But Liberal leader John Pasutos' response is what is causing the most despair among the legions of former Liberal Party supporters in Victoria and around the country. And it's this that I'd like to discuss with my next guest, Australian Jewish Association President, Dr David Adler. David, welcome.
Thank you, Fred, and that's a fairly powerful introduction on an important subject.
Well, it is a powerful issue and there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm glad you're here to discuss it with me. Firstly, David, let's just keep it light for the first question. Did the presence of those men making Nazi salutes in Melbourne on Saturday suggest to you that Nazism is on the rise in Australia?
Look, we have a small element of Nazism across Australia. We've seen a small group in New South Wales. They go and march around the Blue Mountains. In Victoria, around the Dandenongs. In South Australia, I think it's in the Grampians. And they're an annoying, noisy group. This particular group is why we've brought into the argument, because there has been the allegation that the rally is associated with Nazis, and we sought to clarify that. It was most peculiar, as you said, and there are videos that support this, that the women's rally had two other groups that were not part of the rally. One were the trans activists, who for some reason had lots of green and blue hair. Maybe you can explain that. And the other group, that first group was held back by the police. They were not allowed to approach the area of the women's rally. But the second group, which was somewhere around 20 young men, face masks, black shorts, black shirts, black hats, were allowed by the police to march in formation, do their Heil Hitler salutes, and go up to the steps of the Victorian Parliament. Most peculiar. It made for very interesting imagery, and it does raise some interesting questions about what appears, at least at face value, to be quite odd policing. And you're spot on to ask the police for an explanation as to why they treated one group of interlopers completely differently to the other group. As far as I know, and as far as we can determine, neither the issues raised by the women at the rally nor the people themselves had any idea that this Nazi group would turn up, and have no relationship at all with that Nazi group.
Well, it's very unfortunate that they've been associated with it, given that they have nothing to do with them. But it's very convenient for the Premier, Dan Andrews, because he would almost certainly be the most pro-transgender or supportive of transgender rights Premier in Australia. And for the cops to stand down, let these guys do their thing, and then for the Premier himself to conflate their presence with Moira Deeming's and Posey Parker's, it all looks like a setup, doesn't it?
It looks dreadful, but let's remember that Premier Dan Andrews has form on this subject. Prior to the Victorian state election, he smeared his political opponents as preferencing Nazis. Specifically, he said that the Liberal Party was preferencing Nazis. Now, the media were quite soft on him, and there were one or two questions. Who are these Nazis they're preferencing? What is your evidence that they're Nazis? And he just dodged it. He said, I'm not going to honour them by identifying them. And that was it. So he's used the tactic in the state election with some success, and he's now using it against the Let Women Speak movement, and unfortunately with some success. The issues that we understand that they're raising have nothing to do with Nazism at all. They're wanting to protect the integrity of women's sport. They believe that biological men should not be competing against women in sport. They want to protect certain private spaces like change rooms and toilets. They don't want men in prison, in women's prisons. And as you alluded to, they're making comments about children being transitioned or encouraged or without parental consent, etc. Now, you can't remotely say any of those issues have anything to do with Nazism. And when you speak to them, I don't even think you can categorise them as anti-trans.
Well, I mean, but everything you say there, David, is perfectly reasonable, and everything you've said has been said in one way or another by either Posey Parker or State Liberal MP Moira Deeming. Now, her leader, John Pasuto, is now trying to expel her from the party. Shouldn't he stand by her instead?
Well, there are principles in politics and in competitive life generally, courage and loyalty. And regrettably, he's showing a complete lack of courage and a complete lack of loyalty. In order to eliminate one of your team members, they have to do something pretty serious. And I don't believe Moira Deeming, by turning up to that rally, by speaking at it, by standing on the platform with other speakers, has done anything that remotely resembles a hanging offence. They're trying to do a sort of a guilt by association that maybe Posey Parker has in the past spoken to this particular person who is objectionable or that particular person who is objectionable, and therefore Moira Deeming, by being in a rally with Posey Parker, is unacceptable. If you held that standard to everyone, Fred, you could never have public meetings.
Indeed.
You might go.
Well, these are techniques of sort of political debate that are just purely ad hominem and extremely nasty. Now, David, I know you're well connected with some of the people in this situation. What effect is it having on the people at the middle of this?
Well, I do know one of the organisers quite well, and I don't mind naming her, and I don't think she'll mind me naming, because Catherine Deeves has been a guest at one of our events. We don't agree with 100% of what she says, and she acknowledges that she said some rough and even inappropriate things in the past. But she makes some valid points in protecting women's rights, and whether you agree with them or disagree with them, as long as you're not inciting violence or hatred, she's got a right to say those things. And she was absolutely distraught. I got a phone call towards the end of the event, end of the rally in Melbourne. She was very distressed. She wanted to let me know that the event had been crashed by a bunch of Nazis, and you didn't have to be a political genius to know that the consequences of that is that the participants would be smeared as Nazis, and absolutely distressed.
Well, you mentioned courage before. It takes enormous courage to throw yourself into these fights these days. I mean, it wasn't long ago that what the Let Women Speak proponents were arguing for were perfectly uncontroversial. But now to say these things, you need enormous courage, don't you?
Look, it's nuts. And simply because we only jumped into the issue because the Nazis turned up, and a Jewish organisation is best placed to make public comments and judgments as to the relationship with Nazism. So we made the point very clearly that the agenda of the women is not a Nazi agenda. In fact, it has zero to do with Nazism. And simply by making that clear distinction, we have received more thanks on our social media. Many members of Parliament and literally hundreds and hundreds of women have thanked us for standing up for the rights of women to speak. We think that leveraging Nazism for this sort of political purpose is frankly reprehensible.
Yep.
It's disrespectful to the real victims of Nazism, and you made the point in your introduction that tens of millions were killed by real Nazis. I mean, it's an obnoxious ideology, and to smear women who want to protect their rights as being Nazis is quite disgraceful.
Well, let's look at this from another historical angle and see if there isn't a more valid analogy to be made. You are a former Deputy Medical Secretary of the Australian Medical Association. Now, the Nazis were famous for conducting heinous medical experiments on people. Now, is it fair to say, I wouldn't use the word heinous, but is it fair to say that transgender treatments and surgeries are also medical experiments?
Well, there's a foundational medical ethic, which in Latin is well known, primum non nocere. It means firstly, do no harm. And it applies to any medical intervention. That not always do we do good in healthcare, but at least you should not do harm. It's beyond debate that if you provide puberty blockers to young kids, if you conduct surgery that removes breasts, that removes male genitalia, obviously you're doing harm. You're doing great harm. You are potentially sterilising these young people for life. And we know that at the other end, some young people who have transitioned and who have grown up have regretted their decision, and it causes enormous damage. There is also the principle of informed consent, and that doesn't just mean providing information. It means having the mental capacity, and we judge that minors do not have the mental capacity to make serious decisions, life-changing decisions. It's just impossible to fully understand the implications when you're 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. So in a number of ways, I think that transgender programs, clinics that are bringing in young children are breaching very important established medical principles, and I don't know why it's allowed in Australia, frankly.
Indeed, it shouldn't be. It should be, and the people responsible might one day find themselves facing the music. But let's just get back to the political side of it. I want to read you a quote from Liberal Party founder Robert Menzies, speaking in 1974 at the age of 78. He says, "I am old-fashioned enough to believe that principles adopted after much thought and much consideration do not change. The circumstances to which they are to be applied, of course, will change with the changing of circumstances, but the principles remain," unquote. David, referring to the Liberal Party that Menzies founded, what principles, if any, exist in the Liberal Party these days?
I don't know what the Liberal Party stands for now. I'm sorry. I think that they have lost their way. I think that Peter Credlin did a very interesting analysis on what's happened in Melbourne, that any eventuality now, the Victorian Liberal Party emerge as losers. If John Pasutos succeeds in the vote to expel Moira Deming, she turns out to be a rock star, and they risk losing women's votes. They're struggling to keep women's votes, and here we have a group of women wanting to speak out and protect women's rights, and the MP at the front end of it gets expelled. Alternatively, if he loses the vote, then they emerge as weak, that they're trying to do something, they can't implement it, etc. I've spoken to some senior people in the Liberal Party, Conservatives, who are shaking their head at what's happening and are of the view that there is going to be more decline in the Liberal Party before it re-evaluates the Menzies principles upon which it was founded.
Well, those principles have dominated the country since during the post-war era, and it's a shame that that the Liberal Party itself doesn't seem to stand up for them. David, thank you so much for your time.
Yep. Thank you, Fred, and please continue your good work. It's very important to have a forum to
and yours too. Views. I recommend all the viewers follow David on Twitter. And you can find him if you search David Adler or the Australian Jewish Association. Always a good feed. Good on you, David. Thanks so much.